Là, par exemple, pour lancer la vidéo, pour lancer la vidéo, là, comment ça...
In 2018,
Okay.
IFAL continued its work around the world,
Right at the water's edge.
intercepting human and environmental threats, rescuing and rehabilitating the most vulnerable animals, and working side by side with our community partners. We could not have done it without you. With your help, IFAL successfully
Oui, c'est comme
relocated
ça, en fait, ça.
15 orphaned elephants in Zambia and India. Caretakers like Elvis nurture these orphans, teaching them how to survive and be on their own.
That we give them. We are like their mothers.
Recently, 2 elephants under his care
Oui.
and release over 300 marine mammals. And in Malawi, the Chickalongo community were unable to retrieve water from a nearby river without encountering wildlife.
Ok, donc là, on a un blablabla d'accueil. Instant. Est-ce qu'on peut juste... Bonjour monsieur, excusez-moi. Est-ce qu'on peut juste attendre avant de faire rentrer les invités parce qu'on est en train de faire les derniers calages techniques. C'est pas terrible pour les gens. Il y a le café à l'étage si jamais les gens veulent. Merci. Bah, tu me proposes un rafraîchissement à l'étage. C'est bon? On peut reprendre? Ça va? On peut reprendre? D'accord. D'accord. Oui. Ok. Pardon? On va essayer de passer les slides en même temps quand même pour être sûr qu'il n'y a pas de souci. Ok, donc là on a le blablabla d'accueil. Au début du blabla, on a Club IFO et puis on passe assez rapidement sur le tag. Ça c'est surtout pour toi Aurore. Donc une fois que Marjorie a fini d'introduire le sujet tenBoma, on passe à la vidéo. Et là, on est génial.
You know, it's simple, really.
Est-ce que c'est possible d'augmenter un peu le son de la vidéo?
Poaching, illegal wildlife trade. It's run by organized criminal networks.
C'est pas la même qu'au début,
It's
non?
the same groups running drugs, trafficking in weapons, in humans, in conflict minerals. I supported counter-terror operations for the last 15 years. How they think.
Est-ce que vous pouvez mettre le casque chacun? Vous l'avez déjà? D'accord. Tout va bien pour vous? Génial. Vous avez entendu la vidéo aussi? Non, on a passé les deux là. Les deux seuls. Vous entendez la vidéo aussi, Jean-Marc et Anne-Christine? Génial.
Illegal wildlife trade, it's run by organized criminal networks. It's the same groups running drugs, trafficking in weapons, in humans, in conflict minerals. I supported counter-terror operations for the last 15 years. Getting inside these people's heads to understand really how they think, that's how you get ahead of it. If there's one thing that I can tell you about poachers, wildlife dealers, it's that they're criminals and they can be stopped.
Poaching is an epidemic.
vais avoir Alzheimer, moi, à la fin. Oui, test. AIFO, le Fonds international pour la protection des animaux. Tu peux mettre un casque là-bas sur tes oreilles pour vérifier que tu entends la traduction en français. Test, le Fonds international pour la protection des animaux. Moi, je ne vous entends pas. Mais moi, j'ai la traduction vers l'anglais. Donc, c'est normal que je ne vous entende pas. Vous n'êtes pas sur le bon canal. Ouais. Et là, je t'entends, Jean-Marc. Ouais. I can hear you. Yeah. I can hear you well. AIFO, le Fonds international pour la protection des animaux.
Hello, hello. I'm speaking in French or in English. What do you want? I can speak. I'm still speaking. Hello, hello. My English is so wonderful, fully everything you need, you got. Sorry.
AIFO is the International Fund for Animal Welfare. We save and protect elephants in the world. We are happy to welcome you tonight at Elephant Panam. We hope we have a great evening with you all. I really look forward to have a good drink after all that is finished with success. C'est bon pour vous, Jean-Marc et Anne-Christine? Ok.
Et c'est. Qu'est-ce qui t'arrive, toi? Tu te marres? Les fréquences de résonance, tu les entends pas? Toi, t'es sourd. Tu sais, c'est à cause de quoi, ça? Tu sais, à cause de. Non. Attends, faut que je fasse gaffe, j'ai un micro. Ah, encore? Mais c'est parce que je parle pas, là. C'est pour ça. Regarde quand je parle. Oh! Voilà. Hein? Tu vois? Bon. Mais je suis au max. Voilà. Allez, ça marche. Oh, mesdames et messieurs, super. Waouh!
Donc, Faye et Judy ont des casques. Les traducteurs, les interprètes traduiront en anglais pour elles. D'accord. Il y aura une question en français. D'accord. Dans la salle, l'essentiel des gens peuvent utiliser le micro pour traduire en français, tous vos propos. Donc moi, votre déroulé était super, je l'ai communiqué à tout le monde.
Alors surtout c'était important en effet parce que je me souviens que Faye avait les slides.
Ouais.
Et donc du coup, alors il y a la deuxième question, il y avait marqué slide 4 et 7. C'est de 4 à 7 ou c'est... Alors attends, je vais reprendre aussi mon iPad. Amis de la régie, si je pavlove des slides là, ça fonctionne? Je peux... Merci. celle-là.
Ouais.
Ok. Est-ce que vous savez si Faye va pas avoir envie de décrire un peu cette slide? Les premières,
On va
elles
voir
sont
avec
super
quand elle arrive.
parce que les premières, enfin, elles sont très bien, très bien, mais il n'y a pas forcément beaucoup d'infos dessus. Là, par contre, j'ai l'impression qu'on a quand même plus de... Ah non, j'ai l'impression que c'est un exemple, non, avec...
Oui.
Quand on déclenche...
Elle va la décrire celle-là, mais c'est plus pour avoir la décrire quand elle arrive. Je vais d'ailleurs attarder.
Et après,
Parce que moi-même, je l'ai pas vu au niveau, et puis je suis arrivée. Donc, toi, c'était par mail.
Slide 5. All women. Women.
Voilà.
And that women too.
Femmes.
And that's question
Et là,
for...
on passe au
Oh, pardon, du coup, je suis repartie. Ok, donc du coup, pour la partie justement, question...
la discussion commence. Il y a deux personnes dans la salle qui vont faire ça. Donc là, vous avez un micro, Céline en aura un. Ouais. Quand les questions-réponses vont arriver, on va prendre un micro qui partira dans la salle et vous partagerez votre micro avec Céline. Voilà. Ensuite, dans la salle, mes collègues qui vont faire circuler le micro alterneront. Il y aura une question qui sera posée par l'invité dans la salle et l'autre qui sera posée par ma collègue qui est de dos, là, qui se déplace.
D'accord.
Qui va en fait recevoir les questions de la part des internautes et qui les posera elle-même au micro.
D'accord, génial.
Voilà. Et les interprètes switcheront du français à l'anglais, de l'anglais au français autant que nécessaire.
D'accord.
Donc juste bien important, très important de voilà, de penser à saluer les internautes au début et puis de dire voilà, on est aussi suivi.
Oui, et puis surtout qu'ils vont devoir à un moment donné interagir avec nous.
Ouais.
Ce sera important.
Tout à fait. Donc au début des questions, s'adresser aussi à eux,
Donc on est toujours sur les comptes et les pages iPhone, Facebook et YouTube. Et c'est à partir de là qu'ils peuvent justement ajouter des commentaires, des questions.
Exclusivement à partir de Facebook.
Ah, sur Facebook. D'accord, vous n'allez pas chercher des commentaires sur la vidéo.
Non.
Ok. Donc une demi-heure de questions-réponses à partir de 20h, échange vraiment avec la salle. Et donc Céline accueille évidemment tout le monde. Elle nous invite à monter sur scène ou on est déjà sur scène? Et ensuite, le cocktail, j'imagine, est dans des salles incroyables au-dessus. Ah non, c'est ici, d'accord. Ah d'accord, ok, génial. Ok. Don't move. Cocktail is just coming.
Oui. Donc bien préciser avant le type leur place pour le cocktail, mais aussi leur place pour le boudron.
D'accord.
Oui, c'est des classes. Donc bien préciser ça.
Ok.
Dès que les trois intervenants arrivent, je vais échanger avec moi, Céline et Faye.
Juste pour être sûr de ne pas écorcher leur nom, ça c'est vraiment quelque chose que je déteste. Judy Wakongo.
Oui.
Lieutenant Colonel Faye Cuevas. Et Céline Sisler, bienvenue.
Oui. Surtout ne pas confondre Céline et Cécile parce qu'elle a 25 ans.
Oui, j'imagine bien. D'ailleurs, en plus, c'est partie vraiment des prénoms sur lesquels
Oui, non, c'est
de la manière.
pour ça que je...
Mais vous faites bien au contraire.
Donc c'est Céline, non Céline.
Voilà, Céline. Que je garde bien Céline en tête.
Oui, alors c'est bien, ça va être Cécile, mais notre nom se prononce iPhone.
iPhone.
Comme iPhone. Et je pense que c'est tout.
Ok. Ouais. Et du coup, alors ce soir, qui participe à votre club iPhone?
Eh ben en fait, c'est assez divers. Le club iPhone, c'est un concept automne. Donc, il y a aussi bien des gens qui viennent du cabinet du ministère de l'écologie que il y a des chefs d'entreprise qui font du renseignement. Il y a pas mal de journalistes qui ont répondu présents. Voilà, c'est vraiment très divers. On peut passer le samedi à la sortie.
C'était juste pour savoir quand je vais sur des relances, quel est le niveau de précision qu'on peut demander justement à Céline, Faye et Judy, parce qu'il y a peut-être des choses qui vont être...
Les gens sont quand même assez larges entre guillemets sur le sujet, donc c'est pas la peine d'aller dans les détails techniques très poussés.
Si jamais ils ont envie de le faire, ils le précisent.
Oui, Mais oui, 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 je vais bien
Oui, alors bon, parce que c'est vrai que vraiment les actions sont similaires, donc c'est un peu dommage de pas.
Ok, et bah si c'est bon pour vous, moi je vais aller.
Oui, bien sûr.
Non, je vous amène.
Je vais peut-être moi juste aller poser ça pour pas les supprimer tout ça. Oh putain, j'ai plus de batterie, c'est quoi cette blague? Mais ça, c'est un fun.
Non, si, vous pouvez vous installer avec Faye et... Yeah, you have to go. No. We have a photo. So I will send you. Okay. I will send you.
Where did it okay? Show how it works.
I don't remember where it is.
Well, that's smart. That is smart.
Ça marche? 1, 2. Quel beau ciel étoilé, n'est-ce pas? Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Mon équipe et moi-même sommes ravis de vous accueillir en ce lieu
defend elephants, especially in Kenya. But before, let me update you on the fact that we're definitely live, up and running, and streaming on Facebook, YouTube, and that you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions or to give us and share with us your reactions by the very end of this panel. So if you do have a question for one of our amazing guests, please just raise your hand and an handbike will definitely fly to you. And if you do have a question while watching this live on Facebook, don't hesitate to comment below the video, and we'll actually try to be your spokesperson to actually this question here directly with the audience and be shared. So how can we actually prevent poaching in the 21st century? How to fight automatic guns with high-tech data analysis? And can we turn technology and communities into weapon of mass disruption for the sake of wildlife preservation? Before we do dive into the discussion, we will actually be watching a video to be updated on what tenBoma actually means.
You know, it's simple, really. Poaching, illegal wildlife trade, it's run by organized criminal networks. It's the same groups running drugs, trafficking in weapons, in humans, in conflict minerals. I supported counter-terror operations for the last 15 years. Getting inside these people's heads to understand really how they think, that's how you get ahead of it. If there's one thing that I can tell you about poachers, wildlife dealers, it's that they're criminals and they can be stopped.
Poaching is an epidemic. An elephant is killed for its ivory every 15 minutes.
The people who come into parks to poach are not coming with bows and arrows or spears. They come with automatic weapons and they are ready to kill.
Kenya Wildlife Service is the country's elite animal protection unit.
They face the risk of death every day on the job.
These rangers risk their lives to protect elephants. They are often outgunned and outmanned. But they do have an untapped weapon that could help turn the tide.
KWS had been very diligent in its collection of data. There was lots of data.
They're sitting on a mountain of valuable information.
We collect a lot of information, we collect a lot of intelligence, but it has been difficult to store this information.
Much of it is recorded on paper and is slow to get to analysts.
We have a lot of intelligence that is not analyzed.
The concept of tenBoma is a wildlife and community security project.
Operation tenBoma is an anti-poaching intelligence system spearheaded by the International Fund for Animal Welfare and Kenya Wildlife Service.
When the issue of poaching was explained to me, it sounded very similar to how terror networks and insurgent networks operate.
This radical new approach brings battle-tested military tactics into the fight to save wildlife.
Providing something that looks very familiar to a defense excess official.
In 2008, I spent a year in Baghdad embedded with the Iraqi Special Operations Forces as a U.S. advisor.
Our lives and our energies have been focused heavily on counterterrorism and security type operations.
We want to be able to develop an information picture earlier in the conflict spectrum before the physical attack, that being the boom. Over several years of prosecuting a global war on terror, if the focus was left of boom, could we get left of kill in the counter-poaching context?
We are committed to taking what has worked and transitioning that to a new space.
The same methods used to destroy terror networks are now being used to connect all the dots of information, giving authorities an enhanced picture of poaching activities.
The war on poaching and the Ivory War were described using terms of war, but nobody was leveraging principles of war and building strategies to counter poaching. And so that really became the genesis of tenBoma.
Without the goodwill of the community, we cannot succeed.
Key to our strategy is forming strong ties within the local communities.
There will actually be an extra pair of eyes and ears so that they can provide security for wildlife.
Because tips from locals can warn us when criminals enter the area. This grassroots intelligence is our strongest weapon. But the idea is to combine this with much bigger data. Software and hardware developed for elite military units organizes information from communities, rangers, police, Interpol, other NGOs, satellite data, and many other sources.
We bring one highly trained and experienced analyst to come in and try to make sense of that.
The suspects have left Boy and headed south. So our estimation is that they're going to be moving south along the Mombasa Highway.
Ex-Special Operations Intelligence officers study the data and teach rangers how to identify patterns, like robberies of camp supplies, which spike before poaching gangs head out into the field.
There are sources of information from every different angle imaginable.
Can we tell about how fast they're moving?
They moved into the area in the last 24 hours.
Okay. In 2016, data and information are the new ammunition.
We've built a field intelligence fusion center in Voi, the biggest hotspot of poaching activity in Kenya, and have set up a central intelligence nerve center in Nairobi.
The elephants are located and the teams are deployed to ensure that they stay closer to the elephants. To make sure that the area is secure.
Analysts deliver reports right into the hands of field officers, who can stay one step ahead of poaching networks.
With the tenBoma, then I tell you, no individual, no suspect will get his way free. And his days will be numbered.
Kenya is a country that has consistently demonstrated its commitment to protecting elephants and other wildlife. With a strategic influx of funding, we can revolutionize KWS enforcement technology and procedures, saving elephants and stopping the poachers before they kill.
It is a heritage for the world. It's not only for Kenya. We conserve for the people of the world.
And for those joining us live on Facebook, for instance, we're joined by the Professor Judy Wakungu. You're the ambassador of Kenya in France. Lieutenant Colonel Faye Cuevas, you're basically the architect of tenBoma. And Céline Sisler, bienvenue. Vous êtes la directrice de IFO France et pour les pays francophones également. So now let's dive into what's been so crucial to actually start tenBoma. At first, basically, Judy, Faye, you were the two women who actually made this happen.
Yes.
You're co-parenting the project, basically. So who wants to speak about the child?
I can start. At that time, I was the Minister of Environment, Water and Natural Resources of Kenya, which meant that I was the minister that was also in charge of the wildlife. Poaching was very high at that time, in fact, extremely high. And we were coming up with all sorts of ideas as to how we could combat the poaching. The headlines were terrible. You know, 1 week would go by and you'd see 12 elephants are down. And yet there were no prosecutions. We couldn't find the criminals. We had ideas, we had data, but it just wasn't good enough. So we started coming up with all sorts of ideas. One of the ideas was putting together an interagency operation. An interagency operation basically means you have the Kenya Wildlife Service, you have the Kenya Forest Service, you have the police, you have the army, and all other disciplined services to try and assist each other to curb this serious problem. So we put that together, and we had some successes. But the idea of analyzing all of that information is what was proving to be quite a hurdle. And one day I was sitting with the I4 team, and the I4 team came up with this idea of tenBoma, building on an idea that we have as part of our community security measures, which is 10 homes, Nyumba Kumi, but then they called it tenBoma. And I was intrigued by the idea of how they could use the information that was gathered locally by communities, by our disciplined and law enforcement services, but make it high-tech, using very sophisticated tools. So I listened to this and proposed this to the government, and we decided to give it a go. And so that was, in short, the birth of tenBoma, but the expert herself will tell you more.
Faye.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting, since the film, since 2016, and to Judy's point, in fact, I do recall there were at least once where we saw 11 elephants poached in Tsavo in a single day at the time. But since 2016 to today, there has been almost a 90% reduction in poaching in the Tsavos. So that's an incredible thing to be able to say and to be able to see. The Tsavo Conservation Area is Kenya's largest national park and home to its largest elephant population. So it's really, you know, Kenya Wildlife Service will say that to secure the Tsavos is to secure Kenya. And so we've made great strides in that. So yes, when I was first introduced to IFA and to the issue of poaching, again, I touched on it in the film, but you know, I'm a 20-year veteran of the U.S. military. I've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so to hear the issue of poaching and trafficking networks through the mouths of conservationists, I hear it through the ears of, you know, a 20-year lieutenant colonel in the military. And so I felt very strongly that there were things, tools and techniques and methodologies and systems that we could bring into this space and really drive the impact at the scale that just wasn't being achieved at the time. The movie points out that, you know, Kenya Wildlife Service and other agencies had been diligent in their collection of data, but it was in storage lockers and warehouses and Excel spreadsheets. And so our first task became taking all that information out of those physical spaces, out of spreadsheets, and putting it all on maps, and then using some different types of sophisticated geospatial tools and analytic tools to visualize it, identify hotspots, patterns, and trends where we could, and then work across the board with enforcement entities and with communities, really to get to that predictive space, so we were preventing poaching before it happened.
So actually, and you made it perfectly right, Judy, the Kenyan government was part of it from the very beginning, and that was crucial. Again, there is this crucial part played by local governments or national governments in those type of initiatives. Do you have to embed them from the very beginning every single time you're trying to start such a project?
Yes, simply because in Kenya, the wildlife belongs to the people of Kenya. And so even if I'm a private landowner and I have wildlife on that private land, yes, I manage the land, I can benefit from the resources of that land, but most importantly, the wildlife belongs to the people of Kenya. Kenya is also unique in the sense that although we have protected areas, for example, the Kenya Wildlife Service is probably in charge of about 10% of the land area of Kenya. But at any one time, because we don't have fenced parks and reserves and conservancies, because we want to have those migration corridors for the wildlife, that means that at any one time, 65% or more of the wildlife is outside those protected areas. So in order to start a project like this, the government has to approve the project. But what we also have in Kenya is, because we have so many different partners working in conservation with different and complementing areas of expertise, once the permission is granted, then an organization, an international organization like I4, is given the parameters of how it's going to work with the Kenya Wildlife Service and other partners. We also have in private conservancies where the owners and the landowners also have their own trained scouts, for example, but they still have to liaise with the government in terms of how those scouts operate. If those scouts need weapon skills, they will still need to get the permission from the government. So what we have in Kenya is a network of partners from government, international organizations, civil society, NGOs, and then also private owners. And it is for this particular reason that we always seem to have a synergy of communities of experts working together to protect the wildlife. And for me, let us not forget the most important component of all of these partners. These are the communities. And the communities have always been the frontline protection. For a project like this to work, the intelligence comes from the communities. The experts do the analysis.
And we'll come back in a second to the way you actually built networks to empower those communities to help you through tenBoma. But just to be more specific, Kenya has a very specific way actually to handle those type of relationships between NGOs, between local governments, communities, and to manage wildlife. Do you know if there is any other countries in Africa that manages this type of wildlife services in this particular way? Or could have tenBoma been able in another country in Africa?
Sure. The tenBoma is designed that it can be scalable and repeatable. It's not geographically specific, nor even species specific. But it is to take this idea of taking tools and methods and techniques and using that system to connect agencies, entities, and communities across across space, across geography, and across crime spectrum, from the locations among community lands. And as Ambassador Wakungu pointed out, 90% of the landmass of Kenya is outside formal protected area. So most of the time, most of the wildlife are in community lands. So it is, how can we network from the communities all the way up through Wildlife Service, through Revenue Authority, customs agencies, cross-border into Tanzania, into Uganda. So I'm using Kenya as an example, but it is intended to be a system that can be scaled and repeated into other countries as well.
Speaking of systems, let's dive into the tech part of tenBoma. What very specific type of technologies do you use in terms of data, predictive analysis? How did you actually first have you been able to turn into like scripted data into digital data, so that you've been able to manage way more seamlessly the way that you can follow the elephant population, for instance? What type of technology do you use on,
All kinds. It's a pretty sophisticated ecosystem of technology. I say of human eyeballs and algorithms. But the goal really is to introduce technology in innovative ways that will be as simple as possible for the front-end user, either the community ranger, who sometimes is fluent only in his mother tongue, in a tribal language, sometimes Swahili, but to keep it simple for the front-end user, but very sophisticated on the back end. So the initial remit that we were given from the Kenya Wildlife Service for tenBoma was in the Tsavo Conservation Area at a time when poaching levels had spiked to a degree that had not been seen before. So we knew that the work there was going to be heavily focused on increasing the capacity of law enforcement. So as the film mentions, we did that by taking 6 years' worth of data out of physical storage and mapping it across the Tsavo Conservation Area, which is in itself about 90,000 square kilometers. But when you put that data on a map and you're able to visualize it, you can condense the threat areas into locations that were about the size of city blocks. So from 90,000 square kilometers to areas that were the size of city blocks. Well, city blocks can be manageable from a law enforcement perspective, so we could surge, as we say in a counter-terror context, but surge enforcement entities into those locations. And then not waiting for poachers, but to understand through trend and pattern analysis what's connected to poaching activity, what are these indicators in time and space ahead of poaching, that if we do see those, or we see that clustering of those indicators, that could tip us to an area where a poaching incident might happen. And as Judy mentioned, the bushnet, as we say in Kenya, or information that comes in through communities, is incredibly powerful. But law enforcement, Kenya Wildlife Service can't respond to every single tip that comes through communities. So it's really, again, this connection to a system of expert analysts that can lend more veracity to the reporting that comes in, so we know we have a better understanding of which tips are those that we should respond to. So that's a matter of community rangers and Kenya Wildlife Service rangers connecting, collecting data and reporting through mobile devices, using high-powered GPS devices, because it's really important that we see precision in geolocational information. And on the back end, in fact, and this was just from a couple of weeks ago back in Tsavo, but it's doing some engagement with Kenya Wildlife Service investigations and intelligence officers on some digital evidence extraction software that can help them with a suspect's mobile device start to extract data from the mobile device to understand more about the network that he's connected to. In fact, this same technology, I just read a case study. It was actually used in France not long ago to open. It was a cold case. A young woman had originally died, and the original cause of death had been attributed to suicide. But her mother, in this instance, was adamant that it was not a suicide, and she worked with a private investigator using the same tool set to extract previously deleted text off the woman's phone, which opened a cold case. And then there was a suspect that was eventually charged with murder in a case that was originally a suicide. So and then other geospatial mapping technologies, human network analysis software. So again, it is quite an ecosystem of technology, but again, the goal being simple on the front end, sophisticated on the back end.
So sometimes you would say that a smart device or a smartphone can actually fight an automatic gun. But in the meantime, the poachers have access to a lot of data too, and they're probably also using Google Maps or any other mapping system to actually access the routes and the areas where the elephants are actually located. So by opening data, are you putting in danger the populations of animals and wildlife you want to save?
Yeah, so certainly security in the data and reporting is of utmost importance. And so it is through, encrypted communications channels that are leveraged. We're also installing a secure digital radio system which will connect community and wildlife service rangers across large landscapes, which for elephants can be up to 120,000 square kilometers. In large part, though, the poachers, to your point, really are, in as much as they may be looking at Google Maps, they're relying on local knowledge of an area to move around. Because even if you know where routes are or where elephants are, Those are community lands, and you know, if you are there, and if you are in areas where you're not expected to be, or unexpected people in areas where they're not expected to be, then the communities will know. Yeah. So it certainly, I guess to revisit the answer, data security is of utmost importance, particularly, you know, our team of expert analysts sits back in the U.S., so we work between Kenya, Uganda, and the United States, so keeping that information secure as it moves around is of utmost importance.
And so now we've mentioned this very important and crucial word a number of times already, communities. Of course, technology would be nothing without users' adoption. So how did you actually make it possible that communities have access to those amount of technologies and basically are now acting as tiny ambassadors or ambassadors per se on the ground for tenBoma?
Sure. Well, you know, and part of IFA's traditional approach has always been heavily focused on working with communities. Again, in Kenya, and not unlike other areas in Africa, most of the wildlife is outside protected areas most of the time, so working with communities is critical. So we do this in many, I think, really very interesting ways, but to use Kenya as an example, when we talk about communities, in Kenya we talk about indigenous communities, and in the landscapes in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, that's largely Maasai land. The Maasai people have lived for millennia in harmony with wildlife. They're pastoral, and that is a livelihood that lends itself very well to living with migratory wildlife. However, over the last couple of decades, there's been increased pressures on pastoral ways of life. Climate change, the droughts in Kenya have become more severe over the last couple of years, and so when you, as a pastoral herder, when you see 60% of your livestock lost after following a single drought, that's difficult to recover from. So it can be that you know, makes the idea of perhaps earning an income through illegal means more palatable because you have a community to care for, a family to care for. Or it can also mean that you're more open to other improved livelihoods, which can mean, for instance, we work closely with the Maasai warriors in this area through their traditional tribal chiefs. So that's 5,000 young men in this ecosystem, and there are who observe 4 traditional chiefs. By introducing some improved breeds of cattle, we've been able to work more closely with the warriors. They see an improved breeding stock of cattle, and then we in turn have, you know, 5,000 ambassadors on the ground. And it's not that all of them get or use a mobile device, but they know how they can connect into their tenBoma points of contact on the ground, and then that information begins to flow very effectively into the system. And this is the slide that we just put up is a good example of that.
And it's a very specific example on how actually the community acts and how you can actually gather data so that you can actually preserve wildlife. And of course, I'm really proud to say that we're all women on this stage today, but there is also a very specific meaning for tenBoma about this. You also have been able to ignite tenBoma, if I may, because of women, networks of women.
Yeah, that's true. As I mentioned, you know, when we say we work with communities, it really is to hold a mirror up to the community to understand how the community organizes itself. And in Maasai culture, and maybe that's not unlike other indigenous cultures, you'll typically see the male elders, the male leadership, the women, and then the youth, in this case, the warriors. So the way that we work with communities is to work through that organizational construct. So we have Maasai warriors on our team that work with the warriors, and we engage with the male leadership through various means, and then we do some concentrated work with the women, you know, and it's true that the Maasai women are really the core of daily life in Maasai culture. They are the mothers, the caretakers, the teachers. And the builders, they're the home builders as well, but it's really their lives their daily lives that are most impacted by interactions with wildlife, and they have incredible experiences and stories to share about that, but they haven't really had that seat at the table to be able to share those experiences until tenBoma. So we work to organize the women into women's groups. We have 3 now, totaling just over 200 women between the 3 groups. They are all registered as community-based organizations. They all have checking accounts, which in all cases is their first introduction to a formal, or first access into a formal financial system. We've introduced some income-generating activities. You'll see some Kenya bracelets around the room. Those are made from the women in our women's groups, and the income that the women earn from those bracelets goes into their checking account, and they use it for things like, they say, to keep the girl child in school, so giving girls opportunities for secondary education that wouldn't have otherwise had that opportunity because they have children or because they've been married, and it's a patriarchal society. So the women elders really have taken on that goal for themselves. Also funding female adult literacy courses. We have about a 15% literacy rate among Maasai women. So they are now, they have teachers that come and are teaching adult literacy courses. But now we say tenBoma really is an end and a means. It is an end that we want, these communities to be more stable and more secure overall. We want that for the youth, for the elders, and for the women. That is in itself an end of this work, particularly in our wildlife conservation landscapes. It's also a means by which we earn trust with the communities and build relationships and really reconnect them to their experience with wildlife. And through that, we were able to get more investment in protecting wildlife, and that can come through reporting on when they hear about plans of poaching or retaliatory killing. There's a couple of examples of that just over the last couple of months where women from the women's group have reported on plans for the illegal killing of wildlife, which we're able to get to the community wildlife rangers, the Kenya Wildlife Service, and in each of those instances, they were able, the information was accurate, it was timely, and the law enforcement entity was able to intervene before the animal was lost.
Making sure that every part of the communities are on board and embedded in tenBoma, though. Now, poaching is, of course, way much wider than we think. It's not the end game here. What's really at stake when we're thinking about poaching and how we can preserve wildlife?
I think from the national perspective, as I mentioned earlier, all Kenyans know that the wildlife belongs to them, and that we must protect the wildlife for posterity so that our great-grandchildren and their children can enjoy the wildlife. The reason it's important is it's part of our heritage. And if you look at our GDP and our national economy as Kenyans, 10 to 12% of our GDP is based on tourism-based wildlife. So it's extremely important to us as a revenue earner. And if you look at opportunities for employment in the hospitality industry, that is also key in terms of generating revenues for our communities, for our families. And also in terms of just showcasing our pride, as a hub in the region. We're not only promoting tourism, increasingly we're also promoting conference tourism. So it's part and parcel of our revenues, which are extremely important to us. It's also not lost to us that the number of these iconic species are dwindling. And they're dwindling not only because of poaching, but because we're losing their habitats, we're losing the space. Because of demographic transitions, our populations are growing. There's pressure on the land, and in some cases, there is the perception that protected areas are wasted land when people actually need them. So we have to do a lot of advocacy. We have to demonstrate that communities benefit from the wildlife. We must demonstrate that we're preserving this wildlife on behalf of the entire world, not just for us as Kenyans. To get to appreciate this is you have to be sitting in the ministry, as I did for 5 years, and you lose an elephant, or you lose a rhino. the abuse that you're going to get is incredible. And this is from everybody. So that's one. One is one too many. On the other hand, if you look at the work that has gone into protecting the wildlife, the investment that has gone into protecting the wildlife, then you rejoice as a Kenyan. When we announce that we have a rhino has been born, you know, there's celebration, and then we start asking how many more. I remember always having to know at my fingertips per day, how many elephants do we have left? How many rhino do we have? How many black rhino? How many white rhino? Because Kenyans are interested in this information. But the reason we must protect these iconic species is, as I've said, revenue generation. We're doing it on behalf of the rest of the world. And if we don't remain vigilant, we are going to lose them, sadly, during our lifetime. That's why this is important.
Getting back to the grim basics of poaching, basically, there are also rumors or fake news, should we say today, about the fact that, you know, like rhinos, for some reason, can help any type of health, you know, issues in other countries or other cultures. How do you fight those fake news or rumors from data and from local communities gathering data? Is it possible first to fight? And then there's also an economical type of issue here. So, for instance, we have today this word to describe the Chinese private sector massively investing in Africa as China-Africa. Would it be a good idea for tenBoma, for instance, to reach out to those Chinese community in Africa to actually just try to do some prevention here and try to help them understanding that there is no way a rhino or an elephant can make their health better?
We have a saying in Kenya that was coined by the top officials of the Kenya Wildlife Service, is that the only value a rhino horn has is on the rhino. That's the only value it has. A rhino horn is just keratin. I might as well just cut off my nails and then sell that, you know, to you, because there's no value. The only value a tusk, ivory, has is on the living animal. And that animal, if it lives for the decades that it's designed to live, for example, a rhino in the wild can live for up to 45 years. An elephant, you know, in the wild can live for up to 80 plus years. Imagine the revenue that animal actually gets. So we've done massive campaigns amongst bilateral campaigns, and I can cite those of between Kenya and China, where in August 2013, I signed an MOU with my counterpart, the Minister of Environment of China, to say that we're going to work together to actually educate all our populations, but especially those who believe that rhino horn, especially rhino horn, has medicinal value. It's simply not true. And there have been many campaigns that have been joined by many international celebrities. Many of the international organizations have also gone out of the way. You know, for example, spending a lot of time in China to educate the population that this is just not true. We've also demonstrated ourselves as Kenyans, and I'm very proud to say that I was the brainchild behind the burning of our rhino horn and all our stockpiles of ivory, again to demonstrate that there is no value except on a living animal. We know it's a tall order. We do know it's a tall order. But as we've worked, we've seen many prominent individuals from, you know, China who have also joined the campaign to convey the message that there is no value in rhino horn, and it certainly has no medicinal value.
Thank you so much. When you're actually listening, Céline, to all those takeaways from tenBoma and the very first month of the initiative and the way it's been handled on the ground, do you think it can inspire other type of initiatives in other parts of Africa, especially French-speaking parts of Africa that you're handling for IFA?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, we developed a project in Benin with the government of Benin to increase their ability to detect ivory with sniffer dogs. And discussing with Faye, we thought that we could develop the model of tenBoma, starting to look at the public sources, where you can have some information about the seizures, about the origin of the person arrested, and so to map actually and to get some information. But we are at a very early stage at the moment, so we are discussing, but I think this is something we will plan together to see how we can replicate tenBoma in Benin actually, and maybe broadly in West Africa.
But do you think that in the end you could have like tech toolkit inspired from tenBoma to plug and play the initiative in so many different countries or area of the world where wildlife need to be preserved?
Yes, absolutely, and we do. Really for tenBoma, it is kind of this ecosystem of technologies, of reporting procedures, of analytic methods. But the goal really is to, rapidly process, aggregate, analyze, disseminate information as fast and as quickly as we can to law enforcement entities, to communities, to decision makers. But it's that bigger, broader, more comprehensive information picture that we think that can really and is driving more predictive action against wildlife crime networks.
Céline?
Yeah, what is really interesting for us in Francophone Africa is that from the tenBoma model, you can, at a very early stage, you can have some trend, and you can build some tool for the enforcement agencies and provide them with some information so that they can map the situation, and we can help in providing those information. So we will work together in that direction.
In a few seconds, you'll have the opportunity to ask directly your question or share with us your reaction to our guests on stage. And of course, if you're still watching live on Facebook, you can also comment below the video, and we'll be happy to actually have your question on stage. Now, just leave me a few minutes to ask you about the next steps for tenBoma. Where are we heading to?
We're heading to, we've been working cross-border in Tanzania, so we'd like to continue to do that work. We've seen successes there. Uganda, on the border between Uganda and DR Congo, and also some expressed interest from the government in Botswana, and then wherever Céline takes us into West Africa.
I would like to add that the project is developed in India as well.
Yes, and we've been fortunate to work with our partners, Wildlife Trust of India and the India Forestry Service, to implement tenBoma in the Indian state of Kerala, focused on countering tiger and elephant poaching. So that's been fantastic to see the successes there.
Thank you very much. So now, ladies and gentlemen, do you have a question or a reaction for Judy, Faye, or Céline? We do have one question indeed. And of course, you can ask a question in French or in English, depending on your language.
Thank you. I have a question for Mrs. the Ambassador. Do you think that such technology in the future could also be applied to address the issue of the coexistence of people with the animals? Because I think it will be an issue maybe in the future, and through such means we could maybe change the view people have of such animals and maybe make them less dangerous for them?
Yes, I think that the tenBoma concept is extremely important because for tenBoma to succeed, the intelligence actually comes from the communities. That's the analysis. It's then the technology that does the analysis of the data. For people to, although we're having human-wildlife conflict, and like I said, because it is of demographic transitions, our populations are growing, but the space is not growing. It's extremely important that for communities living with wildlife to see and enjoy the benefits of that wildlife. That is absolutely key. And that's why I mentioned that it's the communities that are actually the frontline protection. They're the ones that know what's going on. But at the same time, because many of them are disenfranchised, especially economically, they must benefit from that wildlife. And it's mostly through tourism and the opportunities that come with the hospitality industries. And that is why it's absolutely key.
If I could just add on to that response as well, but the map that's on the screen right now, I think, is a good example of what of this point. In that, you know, the area. Sorry, I'm just going to have to point. If I see a map, I've got to point. But this is an actual operation from August, and this area where we first got the intelligence tips about 3 poachers that were heading in a certain direction came from communities, and we were there, and we've been engaging with these communities because they are affected by human-elephant conflict. So it's by coming in, engaging, setting up bazaras, and introducing some mitigation tools and techniques that we built relationships with the communities. So it's out of those communities that there was an informant that provided information about 3 poachers that were headed a certain direction. So we got the informant, we got a Kenya Wildlife Service counterpart, and we connected with KWS investigators in the area where the source had led us. The Kenya Wildlife Service had similar information, so we put together what we had and what they had, and based on that, KWS effected an arrest of 3 individuals for trafficking the following day. Information that we worked with the investigators to illuminate out of this arrest actually connected to the international buyer, ivory buyer just outside of Nairobi. And this is a photograph of Kenya Wildlife Service pulling these massive tusks out of the floorboard of the resident. She was an Italian national. But that all came from a community tip from an area where those communities are affected by human-elephant conflict. Anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. That's pretty effective.
Yeah.
Do we have another question or another direction? And we do have questions online. Thank you so much.
C'est ça, effectivement. Nous avons une question d'un internaute qui a suivi le Facebook Live et qui demande dans quelle mesure les braconniers sont arrêtés et s'ils sont sévèrement sanctionnés.
Are poachers actually arrested? And where are we, heading with the arrestation after?
Sure. I think so. There are poachers are arrested when they are caught and apprehended. It is a challenge once they are arrested to, I think the typical sentence a poacher faces is about 5 years maybe for a first offense.
No, it's higher.
Higher? Okay, it's higher. Yeah, and this is in Kenya. And Kenya does have a very robust Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, I think enacted in 2013, which is great. Then it does identify penalties for wildlife criminals from poachers all the way up through the chain, which is fantastic. One of the challenges with that is, though, because it is a new law, it's a new legal framework, that it can be easy or it's there are many hurdles that prosecutors need to face as they move a case through the judicial system.
Sure. Let me also just add to that. I'm always very proud when somebody mentions the new law because it's my law. And this we enacted in 2013. And the reason we did that is that poaching was high and the penalties were very low. So through this new law, we now have some of the highest penalties in the world, 20 million Kenya shillings for an iconic species, and then also 20 years in jail. The challenge has been educating the judiciary that these are economic crimes before they were perceived as petty crimes. So it was almost an incentive for the poacher, because here they are, they're caught with this ivory, and they're paying a punitive, something little, and then off they go. But also the judiciary wasn't educated. So again, with other partners, we worked extremely hard to make sure that the judiciary was actually educated, to make sure that they knew the consequences and the fact that these were economic crimes. And so we have seen the prosecutions have gone higher, the penalties have served as a disincentive. But we just didn't stop there. We also equipped the Kenya Wildlife Service with a forensics lab. And the forensics lab has helped also with the prosecutions. And so the number of the cases have improved. But there's still so much work to do. The surveillance still needs to be improved. We need more personnel, to follow up in each of these cases. The Kenya Wildlife Service, only the legal unit is quite small. And so we've borrowed from international partners and other agencies to help with this. Now, of course, the incidences of poaching have decreased, but when you see the analysis of the prosecutions, we still have a lot of work to do.
And following up this question from an internet user, could we think about, again, in the way where you're trying to work super closely with other governments, could we think about one piece of legislation that could actually be implemented in other countries where poaching is actually happening? And could we have like one super sentence or one supra sentence for every act of poaching?
It's possible, but then you see you have to compare the various legal systems and laws of each country. Now, countries do work in partnership in terms of regions, simply because of the transboundary nature of the wildlife. Within the East African community, we do compare. We have an East African Community Assembly. So these are parliamentarians that are appointed as legislatures for the community. And we routinely compare laws as much as possible. And so when there's a piece of legislation that becomes useful and successful in one particular country, then there's always the partnership and teams to learn from each other. And that's quite normal. So for example, when it came to the Wildlife Management and Conservation Act 2013 of Kenya, many countries, not only within East Africa, there was demand from Botswana, there was demand especially from Gabon and other countries to find out how they could use components of that legislature to fit in their own countries. Through the African Union, we also work very much together as African countries. So that borrowing and constant learning is normal practice for governments.
Thank you very much. Do we have another live question? Yes, we do. Just a mic will actually
Thank you very much. I can just ask, it is a very basic question, Madam the Ambassador. Thank you very much. Very impressed by all what you have said. As a simple family desiring go to Kenya for some tourism purpose and of course getting more involved in the life that you have, is it easy to go? Is it very safe to go? We have concerns about safety in Africa. We listen to the news, what's going on, and we don't believe that the borders are very clearly protected. So is it easy now to go there? Are there many networks, safe networks? Can anyone go there just for a week, 10 days, and have some real contact with the life there?
That's a wonderful question. First of all, you're welcome anytime. In Kenya, we say karibu, which is welcome to Kenya. The processes are very easy. You can obtain your visa on arrival. The visa is probably about $50. You can be seen through very easily. If you look at the various tourism sites, in Kenya you have very many. For example, you can go to Amboseli. I mention Amboseli because Amboseli is host to my favorite elephants. I know how favorite elephants are in Savo. but mine are in Amboseli. It's very straightforward. All of that information is available. The level of packages also is available, you know, from high-end to also very family friendly. The issue of the travel advisories, the issue of insecurity and the perception of the insecurity is one that for us now in the diplomatic community is always one that we have to challenge every day. I've been in Paris for the last 4 Saturdays. And I'm still here. The same applies to, you know, to our countries. If there's a hot spot somewhere, we will let you know that there's a hot spot somewhere. But most of the time, it's very, very peaceful and very enjoyable. So we look forward to welcoming you.
Oh, we have many questions, but first let's listen to the internet users and then we'll go back to you directly in the audience.
Une autre question d'un internaute, Chloé, qui demande « Utilisez-vous des drones de surveillance qui permettraient de pister les braconniers, de les retrouver et éventuellement de démanteler les réseaux ?»
So about technologies and surveillance drones.
We do not use drones, but that's not to say that we couldn't. Drones can be a very effective way to monitor activity and movements. But for tenBoma, drones really are just another data feed. So it can be information that's collected more effectively through human source networks or through some type of technology on the ground. In my experience, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a role for drones to play, but they're not a single panacea in the fight against wildlife crime, but certainly monitoring and surveilling activity along borders, understanding movement patterns. But then again, that's one data input that can come in and be fused with many others, and that's how we disrupt the networks. From a human network targeting perspective, it's actually human informant networks that provide much more granular information on wildlife crime networks that can actually be used by an enforcement entity to target the network. Thank you for the question.
3 questions upcoming, and a 4th question though. Let's just dive on this side of the audience and then we'll get back to you, gentlemen. So the first question with you, ma'am.
Madame l'ambassadrice, j'avais une question à poser en fait. Cette saisie d'ivoire en août auprès d'un acheteur, j'aimerais savoir ce qu'il est devenu cet acheteur et qu'est-ce qu'il va payer pour ça. Parce qu'on parle bien sûr des punitions pour les braconniers, mais moi je pense plutôt aux acheteurs, aux trafiquants, voilà. Donc il y a une différence entre acheteurs, trafiquants, je suppose, comme je vois acheteur, c'est pour ça que je pose la question. Et je voudrais savoir où il est. C'est une Italienne, d'après ce que j'ai compris. Où est cette personne aujourd'hui?
The law and the penalties are applied equally. The poacher, the person that actually does the killing, is the smallest player in the chain. but with the apprehensions, we are able now to get to the networks, because these are networks. And so somebody that's buying ivory is also probably buying other illicit products. And that's really what the analysis then points to. The poacher is simply poaching because they have a client, there's a buyer somewhere. And that's the smallest peg, really. Once you get to the buyer, it opens up other opportunities for penalties. The buyer is probably dealing in drugs. The buyer is probably a human trafficker. And that's what the analysis wants to discover. So the law is applied equitably. At least we're moving in that direction. And we have some famous cases that I don't want to cite, because I don't want to be called to court again. So it's working. It's working, but it's systematic, hard, persistent work. It's a lot of effort.
Thank you very much. Moving on to other questions. So we have like 3 different questions upcoming here.
I have 2 very quick questions. The first one is how does tenBoma help you also in court? Are you able to use the data in court, and is it helping the prosecutor in that kind of cases? And the second one is that it's a little bit close, that the former one is how does it help also this system to catch the kingpins, not the poachers, but the kingpins? And are you able to follow also the ivory when it's leaving the country and it goes through Europe or Asia? I mean, do you plan to do something also outside of the country of Kenya?
Sure. Those are all good questions. Thank you. So to take the last one first, the focus for tenBoma really is on the regional nodes of the network, and I'll just use Kenya as an example because Kenya has challenges both from a source of elephants and a transit perspective, primarily through the port in Mombasa. But kingpins are kingpins for a reason. They're outside the country of Kenya in places like Vietnam, China, Pakistan in a couple of cases. But those are difficult entities to get to. But what we find is that you can have just as much disruptive effect on an overall crime network by focusing regionally. And there was a Maasai traditional elder that not long ago, as we were driving, said to me, he said, the Chinese people don't know where the elephants are. We do, which is true. So to be able to have impact and effect on the regional network, there's much better chances and many more tools in the toolkit we can use to drive that, the disruption that we need against the local networks. Because if you're based in China or Vietnam or anywhere in the world, you have to, again, to bring another analogy from a counter-terror space, but you have to have a local network to rely on for recruiting, for logistics, for understanding the space. So where from a tenBoma model perspective, we could look outside the region, our focus is on the regional nodes of the network. Is it assisting in prosecutions? That's another good question. And we were just in Tsavo National Park a couple of weeks ago, and in fact in one of the photographs that we showed earlier. And in one of the first arrests that we made in an operation with KWS in Tsavo was about 2.5 years ago. And it takes some time for these cases to move through a court system, not unlike many court systems. But originally he was a buyer. He was looking at originally a 5-year sentence. So whatever evidence that was available to prosecutors at the time lended itself to a 5-year sentence. And I can't remember the specific charge right now. But through the data and analysis that we were able to assist KWS with, he actually was convicted of a life sentence because the prosecutor was able to connect him with other crimes and with other cases and with other network nodes. Yeah, so he went from originally facing a 5-year sentence to a lifetime conviction under the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act. So, yeah, it can and is being used by prosecutors. And I think, did I answer? Did I get them all? Was there? Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a lot of different questions over there, but okay, we're heading to the other side.
Oui, merci. Une question rapide, donc je témoigne modestement puisque vous avez parlé des législateurs. Je suis sénateur des Ardennes. Donc, en tant que législateur, j'aurais une question concernant les moyens humains dont la police dispose pour lutter contre ces criminels en termes d'effectifs, de moyens humains, peut-être le lien aussi avec les militaires. Voilà ma question.
In terms of human resources, our government works as whole government. And so, for example, if the police needs assistance with prosecutors, they will be found in terms of the government. So I can't quite say the police only have so many. We go to where the experts are. And that is the way we are actually set up. We work closely as a whole government, and the expertise is brought in for each case as needed. Where our legislators and the Senate, for example, helps is in always looking at the adequacy of each piece of legislation. For example, do we need to increase the penalties, for example? And that's where we find that they've been extremely helpful. Looking at the regulations, under each law, how useful is this? Do we need to modernize it? Do we need to advance it? And that's how we have typically helped. But when the police apprehend an individual or individuals, the legal experts are brought to support that particular unit for that prosecution. All of this, when it comes to the legislation in the Kenyan system, of course, goes into the Attorney General's office. And it's in the Attorney General's office where I've heard subsequent Attorney Generals feeling that they don't have enough personnel, to prosecute all of these cases. This is now where also partnership with either the private sector or other international organizations also become very useful, because also they lend then their personnel to support the case.
So I guess we still have some questions on the other side of the audience. Thank you so much.
Bonsoir, merci et bravo pour votre action déjà. J'ai entendu dire que les réseaux terroristes comme l'État islamique se financent aujourd'hui aussi grâce au braconnage. Est-ce que vous avez des informations à nous donner là-dessus?
I can say that they probably are. I think we do, certainly from my optic on the ground, and I think that's another important point to make too, is that whether it be an Islamic State or an Al-Shabaab or a Boko Haram or an Al-Qaeda, all of those terror and insurgent groups are reliant on criminal networks, again, to recruit, to move funding, to do all sorts of support activities. If it's wildlife trafficking, if it's human trafficking, if it's a true insurgent network, they're all operating in the same spaces. So from one side of things, it's Al-Shabaab, but from the other side of things, it's ivory trafficking. But it really is what's the most opportunistic way to make money, to move funds, to recruit other fighters. But there definitely is interconnection between the terror groups and those that are moving ivory.
We do have still one question over there, like second row.
Oui, bonsoir. Merci pour votre action, effectivement. Et je voulais savoir s'il arrive que des villageois arrêtent eux-mêmes des trafiquants et qu'ils les remettent à la police, ou alors, je sais pas, qu'ils en font de la chair à pâté. Merci.
I haven't seen an instance where they, what we typically see from the communities is that they'll provide information on planned activities. So, for instance, we had in 2 different situations just recently, we've seen big cat predation has been a challenge on the Amboseli near the Tanzanian border for the last several months. So many instances that the community where we see predation by hyenas and lions. And that can often lead to the retaliatory killing of the cat if the predator has caused injury or harm to humans or livestock or damage to the property, that can result in a retaliatory killing. And so in 2 instances, just over the last maybe month or so, 2 months, there have been women from the women's groups that have reported on plans for that there was a lion, in one case a pride of lions, that was planning to be killed. So that information makes its way to the community ranger force, and in both instances they were able to intercede before the lions were killed, which was fantastic. In another example, we had a poaching incident outside Amboseli just a couple of weeks ago. There was an elephant poached. And it is working through the community that we're able to, so unfortunately weren't able to stop the poaching, but through the community reporting networks, we've been able to identify the courier as well as the buyer based in Tanzania, and that investigation is still currently ongoing. So we haven't seen the community sort of stop the smuggler as it happens, but we have seen a 4-fold increase in the reporting that the community's been providing over the last 8 months, and then also seeing them sort of self-mobilize to take action in ways that have directly saved the lives of wildlife.
So they can be like sensors, basically, to get to an arrest in the furthest time. But I guess for their own safety, they're not allowed to arrest themselves, poachers, right?
No, the law doesn't allow that. And then you can imagine how you're working in a community where they're very useful is just informing mostly the Kenya Wildlife Service and the other agencies that are in the area. That's when communities are most useful. But in terms of, they don't have the powers to arrest, but they have the powers to convey information.
We still have a question, and it's been, up there for quite a long time. So,
merci. J'aurais une simple question à vous poser. Vous avez présenté le renseignement comme étant la clé de votre opération. Simplement, j'aurais aimé savoir si ce renseignement vous le partagiez avec les États européens via Europol ou peut-être Interpol, ce qui permettrait aux membres de l'Europe, aux membres européens, d'établir une cartographie des acheteurs, en tout cas qui sont affiliés à l'Union européenne, qui nous permettrait également ici, sur le territoire, puisque vous vous concentrez sur l'échelon local, nous, de mieux appréhender tout ce qui provient, les demandeurs qui viennent d'Europe en tout cas, puisqu'on a bien compris que l'Asie représentait un gros client, mais visiblement sur votre exemple, il y a des Italiens, peut-être des Français ou autres. Donc j'aimerais savoir si le renseignement est partagé, de quelle manière.
Yes, and that's really one of the tenets of tenBoma, is to take, to be able to kind of harness important community level reporting in a way, in time frames that can be useful for other agencies, be that a national wildlife service like Kenya Wildlife Service or an international police force like Interpol. And KWS and Interpol have had a long-standing relationship But I think what we've been able to improve, perhaps, or make more efficient with tenBoma is building information into intelligence products that can and are shared with Interpol. In fact, just over the last year, there are 7 of these different individuals within crime networks in Kenya. 7 of those packages, information packages, have been provided to Interpol. Of course, I can't really say what happens once it gets to Interpol, but I know that the information is of use and of value to the agency. And in fact, it was the one case that we were actually able to keep 2 traffickers on Interpol's, their watch list, right? They have, what do they call it, a red list or a watch list?
Yes.
Yeah, through information that was provided from Kenya Wildlife Service, but facilitated by tenBoma.
We have some other questions over there. Oh, we have many questions, though. Just one over there, and then we'll come back.
I wanted to know if you work closely with local NGO on the ground, specifically on generating income activities, or also on law enforcement. Do you work with Eagle or Wildlife Direct? And I also wanted to know who is funding this project. Is it the EU or national agencies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Honestly, partnerships on the ground are critical. There are many other conservation groups. Kenya is fortunate to have many conservation NGOs that work there. Part of the work that we do, particularly in the Amboseli or Greater Kilimanjaro part of the ecosystem, is funded under a grant in large part from the European Union, as well as our work in Uganda and DR Congo. Both of those TFCAs, or Trans-Frontier Conservation Areas, as defined by the European Union, so we're fortunate to have that grant funding. Also, through some funding through the U.S. State Department from TUI Care Foundation, just in case there's a TUI rep in the group. And then also through private donations that come in through IFA. And I think that's another thing that makes tenBoma unique, is that we can take all of these funding sources, and from backpacks and boots on the ground all the way up to trucks and sophisticated technologies, but we can scale that resourcing again across the space and across the crime spectrum. Yes, and our partners on the EU grant are Big Life Foundation, Africa Wildlife Foundation. I just met with Wildlife Direct shortly before I left Kenya, and even today, as we're discussing some of the hard work that's being done by Kenya prosecutors and judiciary, but the more work that needs to be done, there really is an interesting niche between IFA, tenBoma, and Wildlife Direct that I think we can work together to fill gaps and maybe address some capacity vulnerabilities in that respect. So I do look forward to maturing that relationship when I get back. And then on the income generating activities, we work, so that's complicated because we're just kind of starting in this space. But I'll use some of the women's groups as an example. So the women themselves, we have organized into their own community-based organizations. There's 63. We have, I think, almost 90 members in Amboseli, and then maybe about 60 members in the Mara ecosystem, Mara Serengeti in the Loita Forest. But those women are organized, registered, and dues-paying members of a community-based organization. And we work through another local Kenya civil service, a CSO, civil service organization. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, specifically with the women's groups to come in. And, there's things that fall outside the wildlife conservation space but are still incredibly important to communities within our landscapes. Human health and hygiene, for instance, for young girls, particularly as they're starting to look toward secondary school. So we work with other groups that have specialties in that space. But, that's also an area where I'd really like to see tenBoma do more, is in terms of cross-sector engagement. So we're working with communities and wildlife conservation landscapes, but those communities that we want to engage with and have relationships with have needs and desires and vision outside of wildlife conservation. But to be able to open up more cross-sector opportunities brings value both to the people and to the wildlife. So I hope that answered the question. Thank you.
We still had like 2 questions on this side of the audience, and if we do have a question on Facebook, just raise your hand. We don't have any. Okay.
Oui, merci beaucoup. J'ai suivi avec beaucoup d'intérêt d'ailleurs les exposés. Mais comme tout projet, il y a une durée de vie. Est-ce que vous avez pensé à l'après-projet? Ça, c'est extrêmement important parce qu'on sait dans beaucoup de pays, notamment dans nos domaines de la conservation de la nature, il y a 1001 projets. Mais après le projet, tout tombe. Qu'est-ce que vous avez prévu? Ça, c'est la première question. La deuxième question, est-ce que vous travaillez avec les institutions qui sont chargées de la faune? Je sais en Tanzanie, il y a par exemple l'école de faune de Muga, qui est juste au pied du mont Cameroun. Pardon, du mont Kilimanjaro. J'ai parlé du Cameroun parce que je viens du Cameroun, excusez-moi. Bon, donc ça c'est extrêmement important, les institutions. Qui va s'approprier de ces activités? La troisième question, l'éléphant ne vit pas seul. L'éléphant vit dans un écosystème. Est-ce que vous arrivez à prendre des données sur d'autres espèces? Ou bien vous vous contentez tout simplement des espèces dites espèces phares? Voilà ma préoccupation. Merci.
Alors, il y avait 3 questions. There was like basically 3 questions, so we are going to try to take them by numbers. The very first one was definitely about the afterlife of tenBoma. Can we think ahead, and what would be, like the legacy of tenBoma in maybe like 5, 10, 15 years from now?
Sure, and thank you for your questions. So everything that we do with tenBoma is by, through, and with either the community wildlife rangers, through the Wildlife Service, or other agencies. So it's through kind of a hybrid of capacity building and operational support. But what tenBoma hands over is all through knowledge transfer. So at the end of 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, what tenBoma leaves behind is the knowledge. So it's, and in some cases, some trucks and mobile devices and different things. But it's through, we work through mentors. So the mentors will work directly with the rangers, with the Wildlife Service. I live in Kenya now, but it's through that constant and persistent system of mentorship and knowledge transfer with the institutions that have the remit and mandate for the work. That's what I see tenBoma leaving behind. It's both the tools, but the know-how and how to use the tools.
Now there was a second question about, of course, we mentioned the crucial part of local governments and national governments and how to embed them into, from the very start, into this type of initiatives. But still, do you work with schools when you're actually trying to dive into the local communities you can provide the technology with? Is pedagogy and, I guess, learning too super crucial to the success of tenBoma?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Education is a critical component of it, and I know you mentioned Tanzania. We do set up cross-border security planning sessions between the Kenya entities and Tanzania entities, to include TAWA, TAWA, TANAPA, KINAPA, the Endumet Wildlife Management Association, which is just on the other side of the border with Kenya. But it's those cross-border relationships that are critical, and so we do that both through direct engagement, but then again back to the importance of knowledge transfer. It's really to set up those venues so those agencies and entities have an opportunity to connect with each other through some peer-to-peer training, different experts that come in. But we do almost on a monthly basis set up those security venues, and that's something that went by the wayside and hadn't been happening, I think, in 2016 until we had a meeting just this past January, which was the first since 2016. But that's a really important collaboration because it's a boundary just on maps only in many cases. It's the same communities, and it's one-stop border posts along the way, so it's important for enforcement folks to work together. From the aspect of education, IFA does work very closely with communities and provides, as part of our landscape conservation program, 60 scholarships for students in wildlife conservation landscapes to pursue their education from high school all the way up to university.
And I guess then the third question was about the mostly specific population of wildlife that you're trying to preserve here.
Yeah, good question.
Are you then addressing the vast majority and the diverse population of elephants or rhinos, or do you, focus on one very particular type of population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, overall, tenBoma is not species or geography specific. It's really threat focused. So we want to be able to map and understand what the threats to wildlife are, and that means all wildlife, because the rhinos and elephants, the iconic species, really are the flagship species for the ecosystem. But we find that there can be connections between bushmeat traffickers, so those commercial bushmeat traffickers, so those that are poaching dik-diks, or more and more often we see poaching of giraffes. But there can be connections into the markets that bushmeat traffickers access, and connections to how ivory is trafficked through different areas. So no, we look at the entire, we say the threatscape, but we look at the threats to all wildlife, because when you put those on a map or line them up in space and time, there can be connections between the two.
And I guess we still have time for one final question.
Oui, bonsoir. Vous nous avez dit au début de votre intervention qu'il y avait une baisse de 90% du braconnage au Kenya. Est-ce que cette baisse est liée simplement au fait que les braconniers ont déserté du fait du système que vous avez mis en place, mais vont braconner ailleurs, ou est-ce que c'est parce que vous avez réussi à arrêter un certain nombre de braconniers? Et par ailleurs, j'aurais voulu savoir si, du coup, est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner quelques chiffres sur les populations d'éléphants, puisqu'on parle quand même pas mal d'éléphants, au Kenya. Est-ce que ces populations sont désormais en nombre? Est-ce qu'on sait s'ils sont au moins stabilisés? Est-ce qu'éventuellement c'est une population qui augmente un petit peu ou pas du tout? Enfin, est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner quelques chiffres? Merci.
Let me start with the figures. In terms of the number of elephants in Kenya at this point, it's about 35,000. And so this has been steadily growing. There was a time in the 80s where there was low as 20-something thousand. So, steadily growing, but this is just through really sheer hard work of many diverse teams. In terms of the level of poaching itself, I think that the Wildlife Act 2013 served as a deterrent. I think also educating the judiciary on how to prosecute wildlife crimes also served as a deterrent. I think the interagency operations that we have described here today were also very effective in apprehending the poachers themselves. But as we know, this is an activity where all of the agencies and the people involved always have to be on the high alert. If it's cold somewhere else, it is hot somewhere else. And these are international and regional syndicates. And so if Kenya is fairly peaceful, it's probably very bad in Angola or another country. They are that far spread. So we always say, always be on high alert and never, never, ever rest on your laurels. It's difficult work day in and day out.
Yes, and I would agree with those points, and just to add that the 90% reduction was for Tsavo conservation area. And when we started the tenBoma project there in 2016, Tsavo had about 12,000 of Kenya's 35,000 elephants.
Yeah.
But according to the last census, there's actually been also a 15% increase of the elephant population there. So just over 13,600 elephants, I think, were counted during the last census. I had another point. I forgot it. Savo, elephants. Oh, and I would, so that 90, to Judy's point, that 90% reduction, I would attribute to, you know, really specialized, focused, interagency enforcement operations. Yeah. For that reduction, because poaching was so high, and because of where the Savo Conservation Area is located, you know, there's a lot of transit activity that it's poaching, but it's a transit area for ivory as it makes its way to Mombasa as well. There's just a lot of, you know, we say a lot of the onion to peel back to understand what really was the challenge in Savo. And to Judy's point, I mean, that was just a lot of bringing in different and disparate agencies and entities together and just really getting to, you know, building an enforcement presence that leveraged the Wildlife Conservation Management Act effectively to bring down the crime.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your question. Thank you so much for watching, if you're still on Facebook Live with us, and for your questions. Let me just the time to thank Jean-Marc and Anne-Christine for the remarkable translation, and of course Celine, of course Judy and Faye, and all the teams of IFO that have put together this incredible event. Thank you so much, and I think we're heading to cocktail.
Thank you.
Oh yes, and I have a special message for all of you. Si vous avez des casques de traduction, n'oubliez pas surtout de les remettre en bout de rang sur les chaises pour qu'on puisse les collecter. If you do have headset translation, please leave them on your seat so that we can collect them and make sure that they're all collected in the end.